Hey guys, what's up? It's iFlynn here, and today I'm going to be teaching you everything that you need to know about the elemental damage types that we have in Warframe. Fair warning, while I'm going to try to keep things as simple as possible, there is some technical stuff that we're going to have to look at to fully understand what makes some elements particularly strong and when we should use them. We're going to start with the damage types that most weapons in Warframe have before we equip any mods: Impact, Puncture, and Slash. First up, we have Impact. Impact is not the greatest damage type in most cases. It does 1.5x damage to Grineer, Kuva Grineer, and Scaldra, but it has a competitor in this niche that we're going to get into later, which is much stronger. The reason why Impact isn't that great is because it makes enemies wobble all over the place, which can make following up with headshots difficult, and it doesn't apply a damage over time effect. Still, there are a few niche ways that we can use Impact to our advantage. 5 stacks of Impact is going to open enemies up to powers on finishers at 80% health rather than the usual 50%, so this can be tremendously useful on a frame like Araxia. She converts finishers into energy and health, so opening enemies up to this earlier on can be a really good choice for her. Unlike melee finishers, powers on finishers like Araxia's one are guaranteed kills, so if you ever want to get rid of one of those pesky damage attenuated dedicants, Impact is actually one of the best ways to do that. You can also convert Impact into Slash through mods like Hemorrhage and Eternal Bleeding. This can be good on weapons like the Lexincarnan, Kuva Shaker, and the Stelta's Altfire because they have pretty low fire rates and do an enormous amount of damage. But as we're going to discuss soon, Slash isn't necessarily a great damage over time effect anymore. Puncture is probably the most powerful type of IPS damage that there is in the game right now. It deals 1.5x increased damage to Corpus and to Orokin. Puncture does two things. First, it reduces the damage the enemies deal by 40% at 1 stack, scaling all the way up to 80% at 5 stacks. Second, and more importantly, every stack of Puncture provides 5% flat critical chance, scaling up to 25% at max stacks. This means that combining Puncture with weapons that don't have a very high crit stat, alongside something like Arcade Avenger or an Adarza Kavat, can actually make them crit pretty consistently. It can also push weapons with a high crit stat into new crit tiers. This is when the crit number changes from, let's say, yellow to orange, which can result in you doing a lot more damage. Still, it's almost never worth using an actual Puncture mod unless you're using an armor strip Latron and Karnan, for example, or a melee Dodi weapon like the Anku or Ceramic Dagger. Now we're moving on to Slash damage. Once the best damage type in the game alongside Viral, Slash has fallen off a great deal recently. It does 1.5x damage against Narmer and Infested, which isn't great because Narmer are a rare enemy type and Infested generally don't have a lot of defenses, so they're pretty easy to kill while neglecting what damage types you have equipped. The power of Slash before the Jade Shadows update was that it used to bypass armor, which was really important because there was no cap on enemy armor scaling. This allowed Slash damage over time effects to do a lot more damage than virtually every other DOT effect in the game if you ran a frame without armor strip. Now, armor is capped at 2,700 for 90% damage reduction, meaning that a Frax enemy at level 200 and a Frax enemy at level 9,999 have the exact same amount of damage reduction, but vastly different amounts of health. This is important because the damage types that apply armor reduction like Corrosive and Heat were less valuable back then because you'd be reducing enemies from 99% damage reduction to like 95% damage reduction, while Slash could just bypass it. The problem for Slash now is that because armor is capped, it just isn't a strong enough damage over time effect to actually deal with the enemy's health. It can only be scaled with base damage, faction damage, and elementalist mods, meaning that modding Slash onto your weapon doesn't actually increase the size of your Slash proc, only the initial instance of damage. The initial instance of damage will also always be bigger with a primed elemental mod than with a Slash mod, as weapons are rarely all Slash damage, and even if they were, 165% bonus from a primed elemental mod is a bigger number than the 120% Slash bonus that you would get from something like a buzzkill mod. Basically, you don't want to be modding your weapons for Slash, and you will only want to use something like Hunter Munitions if a weapon has extremely high crit but extremely low status like the Soma Prime. There are still some weapons that can shine through Slash damage, such as a Melee Affliction's Harmony, but those are now the exceptions rather than the rule. Now let's move on to the base elements: Heat, cold, electricity, and toxin. Let's take a look at the damage type that has pretty much taken Slash's place in the meta as the go-to damage over time effect: heat. Heat does 1.5x damage against Infested, but 0.5x damage versus the Kuva Grenier. However, the main draw of Heat is that it's an infinitely scaling damage over time that also strips 50% of an enemy's armor multiplicatively with other sources of armor strip. While we're normally a big fan of multiplicative stuff in Warframe, it isn't as good here because we're trying to reduce numbers rather than increase them. Still, 10 stacks of Corrosive and 1 stack of Heat is going to remove 90% of an enemy's armor, reducing their armor from 2,700 to 270, and their damage reduction from 90% all the way down to 47%. If you throw a couple of Corrosive projections into your squad, you can reduce that number even more. On its own, this is an enormous increase to your damage output against armored enemies, but what makes Heat truly potent is that as a DOT, it both has a higher base DOT multiplier than Slash, having 0.5 instead of 0.35, and unlike Slash, can benefit from elemental mods, meaning something like Prime Heated Charge is going to increase both your initial damage instance and your damage over time's potency. Much like Slash and every other DOT, it also scales with faction and elementalist mods. However, Heat can be a double-edged sword because of the way that it actually stacks. Heat is a DOT that can actually be stacked infinitely, as opposed to the other pseudo-infinite DOTs like Electricity, Toxin, and Slash. Every time one of those 3 DOTs is applied to an enemy, each stack has its own damage instance and timer, which the UI then condenses. This means that there is an effective limit to the amount of them that can be applied to an enemy, which is how many you can apply within a time frame that it takes for the first proc to expire. This sounds more complicated than it actually is. Let's say, for example, you have a weapon that applies 10 electric procs per second. At 6 seconds, the enemy will have 60 electric procs. At 70 seconds, the enemy is still going to have 60 electric procs on them, as the first set of 10 electric procs are going to have decayed, assuming you have no status duration mods equipped. Heat works differently. Each proc applied both applies a stack of heat and refreshes the duration of all of the heat stacks. So in the example discussed earlier, assuming you apply 10 heat procs a second, at the 7th second, you're going to have 70 heat procs. At the 10th, you'll have 100, and after a minute, you'll have 600. Unlike the other DOTs where the UI pseudo condenses them, Heat is also actually condensed into one damage instance. So why is this a double-edged sword? Because of a mechanic known as Heat Inherit. Essentially, all heat stacks applied after the first will inherit the modifications on the first damage over time. With something like Electricity, for example, let's suppose both your Sentinel Primer and you apply electric procs to an enemy. Since these are both individual instances of damage, your electric damage is not affected by your Sentinel's electric damage. But that is not how heat damage works. The heat damage over time effect will always use the heat bonus damage and faction bonus damage from the source used to ignite the enemy. This allows you to take advantage of heat by using a low damage but high heat percentage and faction modded pistol like the Epitaph to apply the first heat proc, then apply subsequent heat procs with weapons or abilities with a heat percentage that isn't as high but with much higher damage, essentially giving them the heat percentage that was present on the Epitaph, but a modded damage percentage that comes from the DPS weapon or ability. However, the downside of this is that if you're applying your first heat proc with a low heat percentage from like a Sentinel with just a 60-60 heat mod, or no modded heat damage like from a Warframe ability, you actually end up losing a lot of damage. This is why, ironically, a Warframe like Ember can be one of the worst frames to use heat damage weapons with, as both Inferno and Fire Blast force proc heat in a large radius. Long story short, if you're using heat, make sure that you're careful about where your first heat proc actually comes from. Apply your heat proc using a weapon that has a high value heat damage mod equipped and a faction damage mod for optimal heat damage output. Thankfully, heat is by far the most complicated element in Warframe, so now let's move on to the simpler stuff and look at the other base elements. Cold is the only base element that doesn't apply a damage over time effect. It does 1.5x damage to sentience, but 0.5 damage to tech rot. Cold will reduce the target's movement speed, fire rate, and attack speed by 50 to 90% from 1 stack to 9 stacks. It will provide 0.1 to 0.5 additive crit damage after mods are applied, and at 10 stacks, it will fully freeze the target for 3 seconds and add a flat 1x crit damage bonus. Cold procs cannot be applied after an enemy is frozen, which means that you can't refresh the freeze, but with sufficiently high status chance, you can still keep them effectively frozen for an infinite amount of time, as once they fall down to 3 stacks, you can simply reapply the additional 7 procs that you would need to freeze them again. You can only apply 4 stacks of cold to enemies that have overguard unless you remove it, which makes cold a mainly crowd control and crit damage vulnerability status effect that is a nice to have, but usually not something that you want to focus your weapon build on unless you're going for a flat damage corrosive cold build on something like a rifle, because rifles don't have access to any other primed elemental mods apart from prime cryo rounds at this moment in time. Still, since rifles have access to primary frostbite, you could still get some extra value out of running cold on them. Next up, we have electric damage. Electric damage does 1.5x damage to the Murmur and Corpus Amalgam enemies. It applies an instant damage over time and is the only pseudo-infinite like we discussed before. However, it has the same base multiplier as heat, 0.5, and the damage over time potency is increased by electric mods. Electric's additional benefit is stunning enemies and chaining that stun to other close by enemies. Its main niche is in melee influence builds or grouping builds alongside gas and blast damage. Under the right circumstances, electric damage is a shockingly powerful element to be running. Toxin damage works the same way as electric and theoretically is strong versus Narmer doing 1.5x damage to them. It has no additional effects to speak of but does bypass shields, so it's effective versus the Corpus. It's got a good niche on primary weapons for warframes that can take advantage of the primary play arcane. These warframes include Saren, Araxia, and Cyto 9. In a vacuum, electric and toxin are significantly less potent than heat, but far less finicky. However, thanks to things like melee influence, acid shell Sobek, and so on, they're far from irrelevant, even if they appreciate the outside help, like armor strip in the case of electric, or going up against Corpus in the case of toxin. Finally, let's take a look at the combined elements: radiation, blast, gas, corrosive, viral, and magnetic. Made by combining heat and electricity, radiation does 1.5x damage to sentience and the Murmur, but 0.5 less damage to the Orokin. It causes confusion, which makes affected units attack their allies for 12 seconds and deal 100% extra damage to their allies. At max stacks of radiation, this damage bonus can reach 550% and can be continuously refreshed. In theory, this sounds great, but in practice, since radiation doesn't affect enemies with overguard, it's limited to being just a decent form of crowd control that's not really worth modding for on any damage dealing weapon, though it's helpful on primers for the additional status condition and the existence of single mod slot radiation mods such as Accelerated Isotope. Generally speaking though, it's faster to kill the enemies than have them kill one another. It still has its niches. Frames like Wisp, Nyx, Oberon, and Corrosive can use Arcane Universal Fallout as a slight upgrade to Arcane Energize, and you need to mod for radiation to deal with Eidolons efficiently. That's honestly about all radiation is really good for. Next up is blast damage. Created by combining heat and cold, it does 1.5x damage against Deimos Infested and 0.5x to Corpus Amalgams. Each blast stack deals a small amount of damage after 1.5 seconds of it being applied, though blast can be detonated early for a much higher amount of AoE burst damage by reaching 10 blast stacks or killing the enemy affected by blast. Normal blast procs have a base multiplier of 0.3 and can't be scaled with any elemental mods, kinda like Slash. These procs only affect the enemy hit, however for stacks of blast that expire early, we change the 0.3 to 3 for each proc. This is obviously a massive increase, but requires you to either hit the blast cap of 10 or kill the enemy. This is going to affect every enemy within a 5-meter radius with no fall off, and no, it can't be increased by Firestorm or Fulmination. Since blast can't be increased by elemental damage mods, stick to 60/60s as status chance is much more important. Basically, blast is terrible for single target damage as it doesn't even have the ability to bypass armor like slash. However, it can be outstanding for clearing groups, especially because the elements used to create it are heat and cold, allowing Corrosive Blast to be a very potent combination thanks to the armor strip from Corrosive and AoE damage from Blast. It has some cool niches through guns like the Cerberus Prime and Carnon, which can force proc Blast, which means it doesn't need to be modded for, or on Chain Beam weapons, which can cap out Blast stacks extremely quickly, like the Torrid, Tenet Glaxian, Okikor, Adamus, etc. Next up, we have gas damage. Gas does 1.5x damage to the infested on Demus and Tekrot, but 0.5 damage to the Skuldra. Is created by combining Toxin and Heat. The main function of gas is to make non-area of effect weapons function as AoE weapons. The first proc creates a gas cloud that's got a 3-meter radius, which increases by 0.3 meters per stack up to 6 meters and lasts for 6 seconds. Gas damage has the same 0.5 base DOT multiplier as Heat, Toxin, and Electric, but is hard capped at 10 stacks and can theoretically, unlike Blast, be scaled by elemental mods, but in this case just Valence Formation on Lavos, as we don't have a gas damage mod yet like we do for Magnetic and Radiation. Gas, much like Blast, can make single target weapons AoE, but it's much more effective to use it to make semi-multi-target weapons create a massive amount of gas clouds all over, which are going to overlap with one another for absurd damage. A Split Flight Staiku or Mutilus Cernos paired with a grouping ability or weapon can be devastating. Another way in which gas can absolutely shine is when paired with daggers like the Enodum or Rack the Dark Dagger, the Argonac, and Melee Influence, again preferably with some method of grouping. Now we're going to move on to the big three: Corrosive, Viral, and Magnetic. Corrosive damage is created by combining Toxin and Electric damage. It does 1.5x damage to Grenier, Cuba Grenier, and the Skuldra, but 0.5 damage against Dissentients. Its first proc reduces enemies' armor by 26%, and every subsequent proc reduces enemy armor by an additional 6%, stacking up to 80% armor reduction, with each stack having an individual timer of 8 seconds. This means that with 2 Emerald Archon shards to increase the max number of stacks on enemies, it can effectively full strip armored enemies by adding another 24% armor reduction to take away all of their damage reduction. It can also just be used in conjunction with Heat and Corrosive Projection to remove an enormous part of an enemy's armor and therefore their damage reduction. Viral damage does 1.5x damage to the Orokin and 0.5 damage to the infested Demus and the Murmur. It's created by combining Cold and Toxin. This is quite possibly the single most important element in the game, as it increases damage to health even when it's protected by armor by 100% for 6 seconds at 1 stack and up to 325% at 10 stacks. The one drawback that it has is that it doesn't increase damage against shields or overguard. But that's where magnetic damage comes in. It's created by combining Cold and Electric or by using a dedicated magnetic mod. It does 1.5x damage to the Corpus Amalgams, and Tekrot, but then 0.5 to the Narmer. It's basically viral, but for overguard and shields, increasing the damage done to them by the same 100% at 1 stack, scaling up to 325% at 10. Virtually every endgame loadout that you have in Warframe should have some sort of combination of viral and magnetic damage on it for it to be effective. Generally, we run these elements on a primer. Remember that priming doesn't have to be from a weapon. It can just as easily be done by pets, sentinels, abilities, and a whole host of other methods. Once you've done that, you should mod your DPS weapon for damage types the factions are weak to, and you're going to be prepared for everything that this game throws at you. Anyway, guys, that's going to be it for this video. If you enjoyed it, go ahead, hit the like button below, subscribe for more Warframe content, and maybe consider becoming a channel member to get early access to all of my upcoming videos. Click the video on screen now to find out why I think that Warframe tier lists are a little bit silly.